Thank you. Thank you, Kumar. This is a great opportunity that Kumar, who is a friend of mine and a classmate of mine from Bharatidasan Institute of Management, suggested that because I'm here in India at this point in time, this may be a good opportunity to come and speak about this topic. Thank you to Group Captain Vijay Kumar for this invitation, and thank you for this opportunity to speak before the Madras Management Association. I'm also honored to share the podium with Air Marshal Matheswaran. I wanted, just before I begin, I wanted to make a small little change in the bio. I used to be a full-time journalist working for this publication, Congressional Quarterly, and roll call, but because of family circumstances, we are forced to be here in India for a few more months, so I've decided to step away from a full-time engagement into a freelance writing position. So I no longer work for that publication. What I hope to do in the next few minutes is to sort of present, do three things. One, help explain the domestic political context in the United States and how, if everything works well, then some of the things that we are seeing Donald Trump do can potentially be constrained, and they can act as a brake on his impulses. And then I want to take a little bit of time to kind of help understand and explain the topic of this evening, which is what does Trump 2.0 mean for India and the world. And then I want to briefly touch upon why Trump is engaging in what appears to be this extensive act of destruction, and like Kumar pointed out, withdrawing from global institutions, and even weakening America's institutions, which the fact that the United States participates in the global institutions and the fact that the American institutions have worked in a certain way, those are the real strengths of the United States. So we can talk a little bit about why Trump is engaging in these acts. But before I get there, obviously there's one big caveat, which is a lot could change in Washington, given how volatile the last 1 month has been. And some of what I'm about to say could potentially change or become irrelevant, even by the time this event has concluded. So maybe you all have to keep checking your phones to see what's the latest outrage from Trump. So now Donald Trump is in the White House, and he's acting basically not like a president who has been elected to continue the work of the US government, but like a conquering king, right? A medieval king who has conquered from a neighboring country or a neighboring region, and he's wielding these executive orders like a sword. And he's out to destroy the institutions, and he's just basically vanquishing, pillaging, looting, setting fires to what he sees in Washington. And there's a reason why the American people appear to be supporting what he's doing, and I'll get to that later in my remarks. And unlike any other president in American history, he also has a sidekick, an enabler called Elon Musk, who claims he is rooting out corruption and waste, but basically helped by an army of 20-year-old kids who have just gotten out of college and getting into all the US government agencies. Although the headlines are terrifying, but the actual record of what is actually happening in Washington seems a little bit less dramatic. But one shouldn't take that as a definitive trend, because it could actually get a lot worse. And I'll get to that point as well a little later. So here's a quick overview of all the things Trump has done in the last 1 month. He has signed a flurry of what is called executive orders. And executive orders don't have the weight of law in the US constitutional context. And typically what happens is they get challenged in court, and courts can dismiss it, or a next president can come and just negate whatever executive orders have been issued by the previous president. So Trump has done both. He has basically rolled back executive orders issued by Biden and issued some of his own. One of the things he did was to withhold federal financial assistance amounting to about $3 trillion out of an annual budget of $10 trillion. So a whole bunch of states sued, and a federal court said, well, you can't stop spending on these programs. But at the same time, Republican Party, to which Donald Trump belongs, the politicians in the party also realize that withholding federal assistance, for example, for programs that help pay for a subsidized health insurance program, could hurt Republican voters. So the White House changed its direction and they withdrew that order. Then Trump, as I think is become, this is one of the most forwarded items that I see on WhatsApp, he ordered an end to birthright citizenship. And now obviously this is something that affects a lot of immigrant families, and so that's gotten a lot of attention. But a birthright citizenship cannot be revoked by a president because that is a right that is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution as part of what is called the 14th Amendment, which was passed in the aftermath of the Civil War in the 1860s. And the only exception in that is for children born to foreign diplomats, because foreign diplomats are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States government. So their children cannot automatically become citizens of the United States. And the process for amending a constitution is very elaborate. 2/3 of the states have to meet and ratify changes to the constitution. So courts have basically stopped that as well. And Trump threatened that on the day one, he will impose tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and then delayed them both after both countries said, okay, fine, we'll do what you want. We'll stop the flow of migrants. We'll stop the flow of drugs. These are not brand new steps. Both countries have been doing that, but both countries made it look like this is something they were doing because Trump was asking for it, and he was appeased. So he has delayed the imposition of tariffs on those two countries. And then he ordered cuts of about $4 billion to the National Institutes of Health, which in the U.S. is actually a significant and is one of the cornerstone of American health. And it has pioneered research in a variety of biomedical and healthcare sciences that have led to dramatic advances, including, for example, in the context of COVID, the development of an mRNA vaccine was actually financed by the National Institutes of Health. So cutting down, a budget of the National Institutes of Health could potentially have far-reaching consequences, not only to the U.S., but to the rest of the world. So that also has been stopped by courts. But Trump and his people have had, success in other areas. For example, they have managed to pretty much close down the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. They have laid off about 75,000 government employees, and are shutting down diversity programs across the U.S. government. Now, can Trump do all of this? Well, he technically cannot, because things that have been done by the United States Congress, which is, for example, the creation of the U.S. AID, is something that Congress created. So only Congress can actually change it. But because a lot of the Republicans hold both houses of Congress. The lower house is called the House of Representatives. The upper house is called the Senate. And because they have majority in both, they are afraid of Trump. So the members of Congress are not exercising their constitutional authority. So then the question is, was Trump really elected to do this? Did the people give him a mandate to do all of these? A mandate is usually judged by, how much of a vote a person got in an election. And as all of you know, the American election system is very different from anywhere else in the world. There is the winner is not decided by a popular vote count, but it's something called an electoral college. But even just going by the popular vote tally, Trump won about 49.3% of 49.8% of the popular votes, whereas Kamala Harris got 48.3. So he didn't really he got a plurality of the votes, but not a majority. So he didn't get more than 50%. And in all the opinion polls during the election, voters said they chose Trump because he promised to address inflation, economy, and concerns around that, because voters said that was their biggest concern. And Trump repeatedly told people and audience in his rallies that he would tackle inflation on, quote, day one. Now, it's been nearly a month, and he has done almost nothing to address inflation, which in fact is actually growing. This year, the consumer price index rose 3% in January from 1 year ago, which is the largest increase since 2023. So whatever Trump has been doing since taking office, issuing all these orders, banning birthright citizenship, firing federal workers, none of it appears to be actually addressing the concerns that voters chose him to address. Now, then the question is, can he get away with this? How long can he continue to do this? Does he really, or will anybody stop him from doing this? There is actually one sort of a natural mechanism which is likely to put the brakes on Trump. Because in the lower house, the House of Representatives, the Republican Party has just a 3-seat majority, which means they have 218 seats compared with the Democrats who have 215 seats. And in the Senate, which is the upper chamber, where there are 100 members, the Republican Party has 53 members and the Democrats have 47. What this means is Trump and the Republican Party have a fairly slim majority in the House and a vulnerable majority in the Senate. And the congressional elections happen every 2 years. And so the next election for members of Congress is due in November 2026, when the entire House of Representatives, which is the lower house of 435 members, goes up for an election. And then the senators, every 6 years, 1/3 goes into an election. So 33 senators are up for a re-election in November 2026. Now, of those 33 senators, 20 of them are Republican senators, and many of them are obviously very interested in winning back and getting re-elected. And so they are very likely to make sure that whatever Trump is doing in terms of tariffs or actions elsewhere doesn't cause pain to their voters. But at the same time, of course, how this all plays out also depends on the Democratic opposition party and what it is able to convince voters on these issues. So these are pressure points that are not lost on other countries. For example, Trump has imposed tariffs on China, and China has, retaliated by imposing tariffs on American goods. But if you see what China has done, it has imposed those retaliatory tariffs primarily on areas which are likely to hurt Trump voters and Republican Party politicians. So the Washington think tank called Brookings recently wrote that the most intensely affected counties that would suffer from China's retaliatory tariffs are, in their quote, in the areas of energy manufacturing communities in states like North Dakota, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Alabama, and West Virginia. And the think tank said that these tariffs will hurt Trump voting counties the most. Now, also, in addition to these tariffs, Trump has also threatened to roll back incentives provided by the Biden administration for electric vehicles manufacture. And that is already causing panic in the auto industry. The Ford CEO just recently said that if these incentives are ended, it will result in factory closures and job losses. So you can see that a lot of Trump's actions could actually worsen unemployment, inflation, and other factors for many of his key voters and constituents. In a normal political situation, these dynamics would be disastrous for outcome for any political party, especially when there's an election in just less than 2 years. But one of the odd things about American politics is the Republican Party has, over the decades, mastered the art of distracting voters with all manner of issues, even as the party's policies make life worse for the voters. And, there's an old saying in politics, which is true everywhere in the world, which is that politics are only two buttons to push. One is hope, and the other is fear. Now, Republicans have become experts in pushing the button called fear. And they have basically, created monsters out of immigrants, always pointed to all sorts of foreign threats, targeted non-Christians, and even gay and lesbian people, primarily to distract voters from the fact that whatever policies the Republicans are pursuing are actually hurting the voters. But voters are only one constituency the Republican Party has. The other big one is all the companies and ultra-wealthy class of donors whom you see around Donald Trump. So the other big internal political thing that is going to happen in the next few weeks is the Republicans in Congress, which is the national legislative body, have to pass a budget for 2025, which is already 5 months late because the American financial year starts in October. So they have a deadline by March 14, they have to pass a budget. But they also want to pass a bill that will extend tax cuts that Trump passed in 2017. Now, those tax cuts were one of the largest, biggest overhaul of the U.S. tax code since 1986. So now, if those tax cuts are extended, nearly half the benefits will flow to households that are in the top 5% of the earning capacity in the country, according to tax experts. But that actually sets up a lot of conflict and contradiction within the factions of the Republican Party, because there's a big group of people who are opposed to any increase in the national debt. Now, the U.S. debt is right now about $36 trillion, and there's already an intra-party fighting going on about how to achieve the goal of extending tax cuts without raising debt. And if you want to do that, obviously you have to cut the spending programs, and that could affect poor voters who are getting some of these government-funded programs. Then there are factions within the Republican Party that want to spend more on defense, which is already $900 billion a year. And now Trump has said that he wants to use military force to take back Panama Canal, he wants to invade and occupy Greenland, and he even used military force to maybe take Gaza by force. And presumably, if these are real plans, they would require a lot more defense spending. So you can see there's a lot of spending, a lot of cuts in the revenue, and debt is going to increase. And so they can't make all of this work and balance each other without really having an internal fight about how to do this. To make matters worse, they're actually inventing more and more new threats. For example, just last week, Trump classified several Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. What that designation means is the U.S. could potentially send military forces into Mexico to combat these gangs, creating yet another war. But there are also people within the Republican Party who are isolationists, who want nothing to do with the rest of the world, and they want to be left alone. So these are all people who are going to be fighting among themselves. But if the Democratic Party, which is the opposition, if they all stick together, then it's going to be probably very difficult for Trump to get all of this agenda passed without any Democratic support. But that could possibly lead to a shutdown of the U.S. government, which happens from time to time. And the last time this happened was under Trump's watch, where the U.S. government literally, quote-unquote, shut down for 35 days. So now Trump has also signed on an order on reciprocal tariffs, which will apparently impose identical rates on goods that other countries charge for U.S. goods. And it's still unclear how this would work in practice, because a single item could have multiple tariff rates depending on where they are coming from. And all of this also could mean it will push up prices, further exacerbate inflation, and create huge problems for Republican candidates in next year's election. So there is all of this fighting going on, and how these contradictions are going to be resolved remain to be seen and could become clearer in the months to come. So there are two key elections that are coming up actually this year, which might give people a sense of whether Trump's policies are going to last or not. So two states are electing governors this year in November 2025. One is the state of Virginia, and the other is the state of New Jersey. And Virginia is a really hotly contested state because it keeps swinging between Republican and Democratic candidates, and right now the governor is a Republican, and there's a very strong contender for that seat from the Democratic Party. So if either or both states swing to becoming a democratically elected governor, so that could mean that voters are unhappy with what Trump is doing. So what does all of this mean for India and the world? Generally speaking, Americans generally have, for the most part, have very little interest in foreign policy, I mean, lots of studies over the years have shown the average American can't spot many of the countries in the world on a map. Even when I was in graduate school in the United States in the mid-1990s, if you showed people a map of Africa and asked them, okay, tell me where Nigeria is, no one can spot where Nigeria is or any of the big countries on the map. So, but immigration, which is generally considered under the umbrella of foreign policy, is the one item that has a lot of interest and importance for American citizens. So that explains Trump's constant drumbeat about undocumented immigrants and the threats they pose, which is actually not true. So while the Trump administration has said they will do mass deportations, the total number of undocumented immigrants in the country is about 11 million. And so right now what the Trump administration is doing is basically they are arresting about 1,000 people roughly on a daily basis. And one of the Pew Research Center, which is a think tank again, has said at this rate it will take 17 years to arrest and deport all 11 million undocumented immigrants. In fact, Barack Obama, when he was president, deported more undocumented immigrants than any president before or since. In fact, he was called deporter-in-chief. So on other foreign policy issues like the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Hamas conflict, or the threat of China, are mostly issues that only have interest, there's only interest in that among a fairly small group of foreign policy experts and people in Washington than the average American voter. Now, as all of you know, Prime Minister Modi is in Washington, and after his White House meeting, Trump said that India would buy, quote, many billions of dollars of US-made weapons. And as we were talking, Air Marshal Matheswaran was saying how, one of the things that has been mentioned is India will buy these very advanced fighter jets called F-35. And there is a lot of friction about how India does not want to just simply buy American or foreign weapons, but wants to manufacture them in India. And generally, the United States does not allow technology transfer and only wants to sell, advanced weapons with what is called black box, so nothing can be opened and manufactured. And America also has a very intrusive inspection regime, which is they send inspectors from time to time to any country that's buying its weapons to ensure that the weapons are still in that pristine condition. And India in the past has said that that actually violates Indian sovereignty. And Modi and Trump also said during the press conference that they had agreed to collaborate on developing semiconductors, quantum technology, and artificial intelligence. And I've actually done some reporting on this, but these things have already been in play for several years. And so these collaboration on all of these tech areas is something that I don't think is a brand new development. And global alliances, so what happens to the rest of the world? Kumar mentioned the US withdrawing from the Paris Accord and WHO. So the global alliances in the post-World War II structure has been crumbling for quite a while, and looks like Trump is going to potentially deliver a death blow. And Trump's Vice President, J.D. Vance, has said that Ukraine cannot expect to get its 2014 borders back, which means Russia basically is able to take and keep territory in flagrant violation of global norms. And Trump repeatedly in the past and even now has been seen to capitulate to Vladimir Putin, whom he admires. Famously during the first term, if some of you may remember, that at a press conference in Helsinki, Trump said that he believed Putin rather than the U.S. intelligence agencies. So there's been a lot of writing and, thinking about, why Trump is acting this way. And there's a historian in the United States called Timothy Snyder who has written that Trump is basically a weak, strong man. In other words, a sheep in wolf's clothing rather than a wolf in sheep's clothing. So he pretends to act tough, but he's actually somebody who capitulates to other strong men. What this means for the rest of the world is if the US says it can take Panama Canal and Greenland by force and clear out Gaza by force, and Trump accepts Putin's demand for Ukrainian territory, then the United States is no longer in a position to object to, say, China or any other country taking, say, Taiwan by force, for example. or any other, for that matter, any powerful country can threaten and take its weak neighbors. So how bad can it get? Actually, I think things could get a lot worse, domestically at first, and then spiral out to the rest of the world. So far, when I mentioned several of Trump's executive orders, they have all been paused or halted by federal courts in the United States. But just recently, J.D. Vance has said that courts should not have the power to stop the legitimate exercise of authority by the president. What does that mean? So it basically means they are laying the ground, Trump, Vance, and others, they are laying the groundwork to say that Trump can ignore court orders. So if there's Congress, as I mentioned, is not acting as a check on Trump, and if courts' orders can be ignored, then there emerges a situation where the whole system of government with Congress and the president and the courts that were all created by the U.S. Constitution to be equally powerful and check each other would collapse. So the question remains, do Americans support this widespread destruction of domestic and global institutions and norms? And if so, why? So I'll just briefly mention there is a long history for why there is this rage and anger that Trump represents on the global stage. And I'm sure many of you travel to the United States either for business or pleasure, and some of you may be familiar with these broad themes and shifts in American society over the last several decades. But I'll just mention a few broad things. There's just vast income inequality in the United States. The top 5% own 2/3 of the national wealth. The per capita GDP is $82,000, but what that inequality translates into is, things that don't make the headlines. For example, there's 12% of urban residents live in poverty. A shocking 30% of rural black people live in poverty, and poverty is $15,000 a year. There are some counties in the state of Georgia, for example, in the south, that don't have a maternal healthcare physician for miles, that forces women to drive nearly 100 miles or so to find a doctor. And there are towns in Alabama where raw sewage bubbles up in black people's backyards. And in Detroit, a lot of you may have seen, has been suffering from lead poisoning in poor people's homes. And a lot of this is because over the years from the 1970s and 80s onwards, free trade, market-based capitalism, a lot of the biggest American companies moved out of the United States and just turned those cities into just empty shells. And in fact, there's the phrase that's often used is Rust Belt. All the cities in the Midwest, which used to be industrial towns, the factories are now basically rusting. And this has happened not just in big manufacturing, but also in other electronic sectors. So the people have lost jobs, people have left their towns, and there is a sense of, the loss of jobs, and people have also have this sense of a lack of ownership and, importance that they had when they had important jobs to do. And this is primarily affecting blue-collar workers and working-class people. So this has actually led to a significant decline in life expectancy. Because of overdose of drug deaths, because of suicides from gunshot violence, and lack of access to healthcare and so forth. But while all of this is happening to, small town America, there's also been America's disastrous wars in the aftermath of 9/11. So in Afghanistan and Iraq combined, America spent $5.2 trillion and lost thousands of American soldiers, and tens of thousands of American soldiers have come back seriously wounded, and that will cost several hundreds of billions of dollars to treat over the lifetime. But both wars ended in a disaster. America did not win these wars. And as a result, nobody got punished. None of the generals, they all lied. In fact, there's an extensive record of generals in private conversations telling that, they are losing the war in Afghanistan, but in public saying that everything is going well. So none of them got punished. And on the civilian side of things, a lot of you know about the 2008 financial crisis, where Americans lost $13 trillion in wealth. 1 in 4 American families lost at least 75% of their wealth because of that financial crash. No, nobody in the Wall Street and financial community who devised and sold worthless mortgage-backed securities was ever punished for this. So there's a lot of anger and resentment that the average American voter feels that he or she is being left behind while the well-educated, wealthy, especially people along the coasts, including a lot of immigrants, are continuing to prosper because of gains in the stock market. And this has been also exacerbated or made worse by advances in technology like social media. But I think this may be a point of contention, but there is also, alongside all of these economic facts, there is an unmistakable aspect of racism, leading to anti-immigrant sentiments, resentment that non-whites, black people, brown people, including well-educated immigrants, are doing extremely well, leading many, I think, to conclude that success for these people is coming at the cost of white Native Americans. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows Barack Obama's rise to presidency may have jolted several segments of white Americans to worry that their power was eroding. And in fact, a lot of population projections now say that in about 10 years' time, white people might become a minority in the United States. And if you remember, Trump also stoked fears that Obama wasn't really even a real American and falsely claimed for several years that Obama was born in Kenya. There's a former American president, Lyndon Johnson, once said, explaining the racism that's inherent in America, quote, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he, the white man, won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and the white man will empty his own pockets for you." And I think some of that sentiment still runs through pockets of American society. Now, recently, Trump has appointed a man called Darren Beattie, who is his former Trump speechwriter, has been appointed to become the Secretary of Public Diplomacy at the United States State Department, which is the Foreign Ministry. And Beattie wrote last year that, quote, "Competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work." Clearly, David Beattie is ignoring the fact that the failures of Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, 2008 financial meltdown, all the trade deals that moved all the jobs and ruined American cities were all overseen, executed by competent white men. Thank you for your patience. I'll take your questions.
Thank you, Gopal. I don't know if it frightened the daylights out of you. It certainly did. I was certainly hoping to listen to something a little more uplifting, but this is the world that we live in. Therefore, we have to just accept what reality is and see what best we can do to deal with this reality. See what we can do to better our economies and our lives and our investments. So, again, Gopal, thanks very much. This is really not what we see on television. So this is great insight. It comes from living there and covering the White House and so forth. So really, that's really useful. So we can take some questions, but before that, Air Marshal, if you would like to start off, and then we can collect some questions from the audience.
Yeah. Well, I think, thanks Gopal for that excellent coverage. What you said in the last part is actually the most important information, which is about the inequality that exists in the US. And if you go into the central part of the country, you can actually see that in quite stark, reality. And US is a very big geographical, domain. It's 3 times India's size, and the population is just 300 million. We are 1.4 trillion. Trillion, that's right. So you can see how vast and extensive is there, and these guys are fighting against immigrants. And then the disparity in living standards between the increasingly very affluent people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk is extremely stark, and that's creating a social division. Trump has exploited this for the votes, but this can be sowing the seeds for a larger violence, correct? And the racial issues that are emerging are actually misplaced because Trump has fooled them. That's one of the most important issues. But what I would like to bring out, taking this part, is that the US has been the hegemon since 1945. And if you go through, if any of you have read Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of Great Powers, every hegemon comes to this stage. Because once you've climbed on the tiger and you're ruling the world, you can't get off the tiger. And you have to keep extending yourself. You do things like creating the petrodollar, creating dollars as the reserve currency, and you're overextending yourself. There comes a point, what Paul Kennedy calls is the imbalance between your economic strength and your ability to maintain yourself as a hegemon of the world comes to a breaking point. The US maintains 902 military bases across the world. Its expense on military or defense and security, including homeland security and defense, is $1.6 trillion a year. Okay? And to sustain that, it has to carry on printing dollar because rest of the world buys a dollar. In fact, rest of the world pays for the US's security. And to keep the US as a